The room smelled like old money and fresh threats. 12 men sat around a table carved from black walnut, and not one of them breathed too loud. That was the rule when Zephyr Cade ran a meeting. You didn't breathe loud. You didn't shift in your seat. You didn't let your eyes wander to the door, even when the door was the only thing standing between you and the outside world. Zephyr sat at the head of the table. Still. Like a man who had never once in his life been surprised by anything. His hands rested flat on the table's surface. No rings. No watch. Just dark skin, steady knuckles, and the kind of calm that made grown men uncomfortable. Across from him, a representative from the Delacroix network was mid-sentence, something about territory lines near the eastern ports. And every person in that room was listening, because when the Delacroix network spoke, you listened. Except Zephyr wasn't listening anymore. His eyes had moved 3 seconds ago to his second-in-command, Marcus, who was standing near the far wall with a phone pressed against his chest. Not to his ear. Against his chest. Like he was trying to muffle something. That small detail. That one small thing. Marcus didn't muffle calls. Marcus handled calls with 2 words and a disconnection tone. In 7 years of working beside Zephyr Cade, Marcus had never once interrupted a negotiation. Zephyr's jaw tightened. Just barely. Nobody caught it except Marcus. Marcus crossed the room slowly, the way you move when you're carrying something breakable. He leaned down near Zephyr's ear and said 4 words so quietly the man beside them couldn't have heard even if he'd been trying. You need to take this. The Delacroix representative stopped mid-sentence. The room went very still. Zephyr looked at the phone for exactly 1 second, then stood from his chair. No apology. No explanation. He simply picked up the phone, turned away from 12 of the most dangerous men in the country, and walked toward the window. Talk, he said. The voice on the other end was Dr. Amara Elkins, lead physician at Mercy General's trauma unit, a woman Zephyr paid quietly and generously to handle certain situations without paperwork trails. She didn't rattle easily. She had seen things that would end most people's sleep permanently. But right now, her voice had an edge in it that Zephyr had never heard before. We have a child, she said. Male. Approximately 5 years old. No ID. No guardian. He came in with 3 others from the Westfield raid. The others are responding to staff, responding to comfort, responding to basic stimulation. This child is not. Zephyr said nothing. He won't eat. Won't accept touch. Won't respond to his name because he won't give us one. He just sits. And repeats a word. 1 word. Over and over. A pause. We thought it was a request at first. Or a trauma response. But Mr. Cade, it's not a word. Zephyr's hand tightened around the phone. 1 degree. It's a name. The room behind him had gone so quiet he could hear the wall clock. He keeps saying Zephyr. The window in front of him showed the city spread out 40 floors below. Lights. Traffic. A world moving like nothing had shifted. But something had. Something had shifted in a way Zephyr could feel in the back of his throat. He's been saying it for 6 hours straight. Dr. Elkins continued. We can't sedate a child this small without risk. He won't let any of us near him. But the second one of my nurses said your name back to him, just to see, he stopped. Silence. He stopped, looked at her, and said it again. Clearer this time. Like a question. Like he was asking if you were coming. Zephyr stood at the window for 4 seconds. 4 full seconds. Then he turned around, and without looking at a single face in that room, He picked up his jacket from the back of the chair, walked to the door, and left. No one called after him. No one asked where he was going. Because they had all seen his face when he turned, and not one of them had ever seen that expression on Zephyr Cade before. Hi viewers, here's what I need to know right now. If a child you never knew existed started calling your name like it was the only safe word he'd ever learned, what would you do first? The elevator opened. Zephyr stepped in. The doors closed behind him. And in the silence of that small metal box, alone for the first time in hours, he pressed his back against the wall and let himself think the one question he hadn't let himself think upstairs. Why would a child he had never met already know his name? The city moved past the car windows like it had no opinion about any of this. Zephyr sat in the back seat and said nothing for 11 minutes. His driver, Damon, knew better than to fill silence with sound. He kept his eyes forward and his hands steady at 10 and 2, and the SUV moved through downtown traffic like it owned every lane. Zephyr's phone sat face down on the seat beside him. He didn't pick it up. He was thinking about a name he hadn't said out loud in 3 years. Caius Merrill. Not a dangerous name on its own. Not a name that belonged in the same world as port negotiations and trafficking raids and rooms full of men who carried weapons under their jackets. Caius was the kind of person who had no business being anywhere near Zephyr's life. And yet he had walked into it anyway. Zephyr hadn't brought him in. That was the part that still didn't sit right, even now. Caius had appeared the way certain people appear, not loudly, not with an agenda, but so precisely at the right moment that you don't question it until it's already too late to undo. They'd met at a private medical consultation. Caius was a quiet man, careful with his words. The kind of person who watched more than he spoke and understood more than he let on. He was an Omega, and in Zephyr's world, that came with 100 assumptions attached, but Caius met none of them. He didn't lower his voice when Zephyr raised his. He didn't step back. He didn't perform smallness. He just looked at Zephyr like he was a person. Not a boss. Not a threat. Not an advantage. A person. That was the thing that broke through first. Over months, something built between them that Zephyr had no clean word for. It wasn't performance. It wasn't strategy. It was the kind of closeness that forms when two people stop pretending they don't see each other clearly. Zephyr had told Caius things he had never said to Marcus. Not plans, not operations, but real things. Quiet things. Things that lived underneath all the power and the structure and the control. Caius had listened. And then one morning Caius was gone. No call. No note. No trace anywhere in the apartment they had shared for 7 months. His clothes were still in the closet. His coffee mug was still on the counter. His phone went straight to a disconnected tone on the first ring. Like he had simply stepped out of existence. Zephyr had spent 3 weeks searching. Quietly. Privately. Using every resource he had, and he had considerable resources. Nothing. No body. No trail. No signal. His people concluded the obvious. Caius had left deliberately. That the disappearance was planned. That he had walked out with nothing because he'd been planning to walk out for longer than Zephyr knew. And eventually Zephyr had stopped searching. Not because he believed it, but because continuing to search meant continuing to feel something. And Zephyr Cade did not do that. He buried Caius Merrill the way he buried everything that couldn't be controlled, deep, clean, and without a marker. He rebuilt the distance he had let collapse. Reinforced the walls. Went back to running an empire with both hands and a clear head. He told himself it was choice. He told himself Caius had chosen to go. The car stopped at a red light. Zephyr looked at his reflection in the dark-tinted window. 3 years. A child who shouldn't know his name. A word repeated for 6 hours in a trauma ward by a boy with no identity and no guardian. Something was wrong with the conclusion he had built. Something had always been wrong with it. He just hadn't let himself go back to look. The light turned green. Damon pulled forward without a word. And Zephyr sat with the quiet that comes right before a man accepts that everything he decided to believe might have been the one thing that destroyed him. Mercy General's 4th floor smelled like antiseptic and recycled air. Zephyr moved through the corridor with Marcus 1 step behind and 2 of his men stationed near the elevator. Dr. Elkins met them at the end of the hall, tablet in hand, reading glasses pushed up on her forehead. She looked tired in the way people look when they'd been managing something impossible for too long. "He's been quieter the last 20 minutes, she said without preamble. Which is actually more concerning than the repetition. She pulled up the case summary on her tablet as they walked. No identifying documents. No birth record match in the system yet. Physical exam puts him at 4 to 5 years old, possibly closer to 5. He's small for his age, which suggests nutritional inconsistency over an extended period. There are old bruising patterns on his forearms consistent with restraint. No acute injuries. No signs of recent physical trauma beyond what we'd expect from the transport conditions." She stopped outside a closed door with a narrow wire-reinforced window. He was found in a locked storage unit in the Westfield facility with 2 other children and 1 adult. The adult was unconscious when they arrived. The other children were in significantly better physical condition. This child was in the corner when the team entered. He didn't move. Didn't respond to his name because he wouldn't give one. She paused. He gave yours instead. Zephyr looked through the window. The room was small and softly lit. A hospital bed. For line running into a thin arm. A white blanket pulled up to the middle of a small chest. The boy was sitting up, barely, with his back against the pillow and his eyes fixed on the wall across from him. He wasn't moving. But he wasn't sleeping either. He was waiting. That was the only word for it. The posture of a child who has learned that the most useful thing you can do when you have no power is stay still and wait for the right thing to appear. Zephyr watched him for a moment. "Has he eaten?" he asked. 3 attempts. He accepted 4 sips of water an hour ago and refused everything else. Does he speak at all? Beyond the name? Single words. Mostly functional. Stop. No, cold. He understands full sentences. His responses are appropriate, just minimal. Dr. Elkins hesitated. He asked once if you were coming. The hallway went quiet. One of our nurses made the mistake of telling him she didn't know who that was. He didn't respond again for 2 hours. Zephyr pushed the door open. The sound of it moving was quiet, just the soft mechanical press of the hinges. But the boy's head turned immediately. Fast. The kind of fast that belongs to people who have learned to track the source of every sound before it reaches them. His eyes found Zephyr. And stopped. The boy was small. Dark skin, close-cut hair growing out unevenly, eyes that were too careful for his age. He had the look of a child who had been taught, not by words but by circumstance, that the world was not safe and that trust was a thing you spent carefully. But when he looked at Zephyr, something in his face shifted. Not relief. Not joy. Recognition. Like he was looking at someone he had been shown in a photograph. Someone described to him in detail. Someone he had been told to find, or told would come. Zephyr stopped in the middle of the room. The boy's mouth opened. Zephyr? Not a statement. A question. The same word. But this time it had weight behind it. It had direction. It was aimed, carefully and deliberately, at the exact person standing in that doorway. Nobody in the room spoke. The boy slowly pushed the blanket aside with his free hand, the one without the foreline, and held it out. Not reaching. Not grabbing. Offering. Like he had been told that when this person arrived, you hold out your hand. Zephyr crossed the room in 4 steps and crouched down to the boy's eye level. Up close, the child's eyes were steady. Dark brown with flecks of something lighter near the center. There was exhaustion in them, real deep exhaustion, but underneath it was something else entirely. Something deliberate. This child had been waiting for him specifically. Not rescued into hope. Directed toward him. Zephyr looked at the small hand still held out between them. Then he looked at the child's face again. And something moved in his chest that he had no name for. Dr. Elkins stepped into the doorway behind him. Her voice was quiet. Mr. Cade. There's something else. Zephyr didn't turn around. The adult found unconscious in the storage unit. A pause. He's been stabilized. He's in the private ward on the 6th floor. Still Zephyr didn't move. He had no ID either. But when we ran his prints against our intake system, she stopped. Cleared her throat. He's been here before. 7 months ago. Under a different name. The boy's hand was still extended. Still waiting. The name he used the first time, Dr. Elkins said carefully, was Caius Merrill. The 6th floor was different from the 4th. Quieter. Fewer staff. The kind of ward that existed for patients who needed privacy more than they needed proximity to a nursing station. Zephyr had funded this section 3 years ago, officially, as a donation to the hospital's low-income patient support initiative. Unofficially, it existed for exactly moments like this one. He stood outside room 614 for a full 10 seconds before he opened the door. Marcus had stayed downstairs with the boy. Zephyr had told him to, and Marcus had looked at him once, the kind of look that asked whether he was sure, and then stepped aside without a word. Room 614 was dim. One lamp on the far wall. A monitor running a quiet green line. The smell of antiseptic was stronger here, sharper, layered with something medicinal that Zephyr recognized as the aftermath of a serious sedation reversal. The bed was positioned toward the window. The figure in it was small against the white of the sheets. Thinner than Zephyr remembered. One arm connected to a line. Bandaging on the left shoulder, visible above the edge of the hospital gown. Dark hair against the pillow, longer than before, matted at the temples. Caius Merrill was alive. That was the first thing. Alive, and here, and real, not a conclusion Zephyr had buried but an actual person breathing in an actual bed 12 feet in front of him. Zephyr walked to the chair beside the bed and sat down. He didn't touch him. Didn't speak. Just sat and looked at the face he had spent 3 years telling himself he was done looking for. Caius was awake. Not fully. His eyes were open only halfway, still weighted with whatever they'd had him on, but they were tracking. They moved to Zephyr's face and stayed there. And in them was something complicated. Something that wasn't relief, wasn't happiness, wasn't the expression of a person who had been waiting to be found. It was closer to dread. You weren't supposed to find us. His voice was rough. Barely above a sound. But the words were clear. Zephyr looked at him. You've been awake for 30 seconds, Zephyr said. His voice was flat and even and completely controlled. And that's the first thing you say. Caius closed his eyes for a moment. Opened them again. His jaw was set in a way that Zephyr recognized, the specific way Caius's face looked when he was holding something in because letting it out would cost too much. "Where is he?" Caius asked. "Downstairs. 4th floor. He's stable." Something moved through Caius's expression. Not relief exactly. Something more like the specific physical sensation of a held breath finally releasing. His eyes went to the ceiling. "Is he asking for me?" "He stopped asking for you," Zephyr said. "He started asking for me." Caius didn't respond to that. The monitor continued its quiet line. Outside the window, the city moved without them. 3 years, Zephyr said. Caius said nothing. No call. No note. No trace. Zephyr's voice stayed even. He had spent years making it stay even in rooms where everything was falling apart, and he was spending that discipline now. "My people decided you chose to go. I let them decide that." Still nothing. "Did you?" Caius turned his head on the pillow. Not toward Zephyr. Away from him. Toward the window. "It doesn't matter what I chose," he said quietly. "It matters to me. That's the problem." Caius's voice didn't rise. It went lower. "That was always the problem, Zephyr. What mattered to you didn't protect anyone." The room held that sentence for a long moment. Zephyr looked at the bandaging on Caius's shoulder. The thinness of his arm. The way his collarbone was visible above the neckline of the hospital gown in a way it hadn't been before. Years of something difficult written into his body. He looked at the face turned away from him. And something he had kept controlled for a long time, kept behind walls and routines and a clean forward motion of power, began to fracture. Not loudly. Just a crack. Just enough for what was underneath to see daylight. "Was the child there when they found you?" he asked. A pause. "Yes." "How long had you been in that facility?" Caius didn't answer. "Caius." "Long enough." Short. Final. A door closed in 2 words. Zephyr sat with that. Sat with the weight of what long enough covered. What it meant. What it mapped onto the timeline of a disappearance he had eventually stopped investigating. He looked at the hand nearest him on the mattress. Still. Pale at the knuckles. "The boy," he said carefully. Caius went very still. "He has my eyes." The silence after that was a different kind of silence. Caius did not move. Did not confirm. Did not deny. But he didn't turn back toward the window either. He stayed exactly where he was, face half turned away, jaw working slowly, and that was answer enough. That was more answer than anything he could have said out loud. Zephyr stood from the chair. He didn't move toward the door. He stood at the side of the bed and looked down at a man he had loved in a quiet way that he'd never been able to put properly into language, and the full weight of 3 years landed on him all at once. Not anger. Not accusation. Weight. The specific weight of a man who built power over everything, and somehow still missed the one thing that needed him most. The truth didn't arrive in one piece. It came the way certain things come, reluctantly, in fragments, with long silences between each part. Like a person choosing carefully which wound to show first. Caius talked for a while, then stopped. Then started again. Zephyr didn't push. He sat in the chair beside the bed and he listened, because for the first time in longer than he could track, listening felt like the only honest thing available to him. The first part came out almost accidentally. "I didn't pack anything," Caius said, staring at the ceiling. "People don't understand that." They think leaving means you take what's yours. I didn't have time to decide what was mine. Zephyr said nothing. I got a call 2 days before. Someone who said they had information about you. About an operation. They said if I wanted to keep you safe, I needed to meet them privately. No security. No Marcus. No trace. He paused. I know how that sounds. You went anyway. I was 3 weeks along. The words dropped into the room quietly. I hadn't told you yet. I was trying to figure out how. He exhaled. I thought if whatever they had was serious enough, if I could deal with it before you knew, I could protect both of us. Zephyr's hands were still on his knees. They were waiting for me at the location. Caius continued. It wasn't information. It was a grab. They had 2 people inside before I understood what was happening. The room was very quiet. I tried to get word to you. The first week. There was a man on staff at the first location who I thought I could reach. It didn't work. He stopped. After that, communication wasn't possible. And after a certain point, his voice changed slightly. Tightened. I was more focused on staying alive. Where were you held? 3 different locations over 18 months. Then we were consolidated. The Westfield facility was the last one. Zephyr processed that. 18 months of active captivity. Then another 1.5 years at Westfield before the raid. 3 years. The exact gap. Cale was born at the second location, Caius said. It was the first time the child had been named. Cale. Zephyr held that word quietly. He's healthy? Caius asked. His voice had dropped again. Carefully controlled, but the care itself gave it away. He's small. But the doctors say there's no permanent damage. Caius nodded slowly, like he needed a moment with that information before he could move past it. I told him about you, he said. I don't know if that was right. I told myself it was so he'd have something. Something to anchor to, something that was bigger than the walls he was looking at. He paused. I described you. Your voice. Your name. I told him that if something happened to me, he should say your name. Say it to anyone who would listen, loud enough that it would find its way back. The lamp on the far wall hummed faintly. He took that seriously, Zephyr said. He takes everything seriously. For the first time, something shifted at the edge of Caius's expression. Not quite a smile. Something smaller and sadder and more real than a smile. He's been doing that since he could sit up on his own. Zephyr stood and moved to the window. The city below was moving through early morning. Delivery trucks. Streetlights still on. A world that had no idea what had been sitting in a locked facility in its own neighborhood for 3 years. The raid? Zephyr said. How did it happen? I don't know all of it. One of the guards said something about a financial trace. Someone flagged a payment account. Whoever flagged it had enough pull to push for an immediate tactical response instead of a standard investigation. Caius paused. I don't know who that was. Zephyr turned from the window. I do. Caius looked at him. Marcus found a thread 8 weeks ago. He didn't know what he was pulling yet. He brought it to me as a financial anomaly. A series of shell payments running through a distribution company we had a passive stake in. I told him to keep pulling. Zephyr's jaw was tight. He pulled far enough. The silence between them shifted. It's bigger than a trafficking ring, Zephyr said. The words were flat. Precise. The Westfield facility was one node. There are others. And the funding isn't coming from street-level operations. It's coming from institutions. Caius stared at him. Political donors. 2 municipal contracts. A private foundation that runs youth outreach programs in 4 cities. Zephyr's voice didn't rise. It dropped. They'd been using the outreach programs as an intake pipeline. Something moved across Caius's face. Something that wasn't shock, because at a certain point, a person runs out of capacity for shock, but something that landed like confirmation of a fear too big to fully name. They targeted me because of you, he said. Zephyr looked at him. Someone knew what I was to you. Knew that taking me would keep you from looking in certain directions. It wasn't random. Caius's voice was steady. Deliberately steady. Someone close to you decided I was a useful lever. The lamp hummed. The monitor beeped its quiet rhythm. Zephyr stood at the window of the 6th floor, the city spread out behind him, and felt the full shape of what 3 years had actually been. Not an absence. Not a choice. A construction. Someone had built the silence between them deliberately, brick by brick, and then left Zephyr inside it. Who knew about us? Zephyr asked. Caius was quiet for a moment. 3 people on my side. On my, Zephyr said slowly. 4. They looked at each other. And downstairs on the 4th floor, in a small dim room with a white blanket and in 4 line, a boy named Cale sat with Marcus and waited for his father to come back. He wasn't worried. He had already learned something important about the man whose name he carried like a lifeline. When Zephyr Cade came for you, he finished what he started. Zephyr didn't go home that night. He sat in the parking structure across from Mercy General for 47 minutes, and didn't start the car. Marcus had texted twice. Both times Zephyr read the message, set the phone face down on the center console, and went back to staring at the concrete wall in front of him. It was gray. Unremarkable. The kind of surface that gave nothing back. That was fine. He wasn't looking for anything back. He was trying to hold still long enough for the thing building in his chest to settle into a shape he could actually work with. It wasn't anger. He knew what his anger felt like. Anger was clean. Anger had direction. Anger was a tool he had used for 20 years to move obstacles and compress timelines and remind people that the distance between a request and a consequence was shorter than they assumed. This was not that. This was something quieter and worse. This was the specific feeling of a man staring at a ledger and realizing the column he thought was balanced had been off the entire time. Every number. Every entry. The whole structure. Built on a wrong assumption he had accepted without enough scrutiny because accepting it was easier than continuing to look. He had built an empire. That was the fact he had organized everything around for 3 years. He had built something from nothing, from street-level operations and leveraged relationships, and the kind of ruthless patience that most men couldn't maintain. He had created structure where there was chaos. He had made himself untouchable. And while he was doing that, a man who had understood him better than anyone alive had been held in a locked facility 18 miles from his office. A child had been born in captivity. Had grown up in captivity. Had been given one name to hold on to. His. Zephyr pressed the back of his head against the headrest. His name. Not for comfort. For survival. Caius had given Cale his name the way you give someone a compass before you send them into the dark, because without it, they have no direction home. Because without it, they are just a small body in an impossible situation with no anchor and no way out. And Cale had held that name for years. Had said it quietly in the dark, probably. Had practiced it. Had believed in it the way children believe in things before the world teaches them to stop, completely, without condition, without needing proof. The weight of that was staggering. Not because it was beautiful. Because it was an indictment. An indictment of every day Zephyr had spent telling himself the absence was a choice. Every morning he had redirected his attention toward the next problem, the next expansion, the next strategic decision. Every meeting he had run with 2 hands and a clear head, while telling himself the clarity was strength. It wasn't strength. It was avoidance wearing the mask of discipline. Power without awareness isn't strength. He understood that now in a way he couldn't have understood it before. Not as a concept, not as a principle, but as a physical thing sitting in his sternum. It's delayed regret. He sat with that for a long time. Then he picked up his phone. Marcus answered on the first ring. I need everything we have on the 4 people who knew about Caius, Zephyr said. Financial history. Movement logs. Communication records going back 4 years. Everything. A pause. Tonight? Now. Another pause. Shorter this time. Done. Zephyr started the car. He didn't feel better. That wasn't the point. The point was that sitting in a parking structure processing grief was not the same as doing something about it. And the one thing Zephyr Cade had never been able to do, the one thing that was genuinely not available to him as an option, was nothing. Cale was on the 4th floor. Caius was on the 6th. Someone who had been inside Zephyr's circle for years had handed them both to a machine that treated human lives as inventory. Regret could exist. But it would have to exist alongside action. Because the investigation that Marcus had stumbled into 8 weeks ago was not finished. And someone out there still didn't know that Zephyr was coming. That was the last advantage he had. He intended to use it. The file Marcus put together ran 43 pages. Zephyr read it at the kitchen table of his secondary location, a brownstone in the north end that only 6 people knew about, with black coffee and no overhead lights. Just the desk lamp and the documents, and the quiet that comes at 3 in the morning when the rest of the city has gone somewhere softer. The financial thread Marcus had originally flagged, the shell payments running through the distribution company, was the visible end of something much longer. Pull it, and what came out wasn't a single operation. It was a network. The Westfield facility was one node. That was clear within the first 10 pages. But the funding architecture behind it connected upward in a direction Zephyr hadn't fully anticipated, even with everything he already knew about how protected money moved. 2 municipal infrastructure contracts. Both awarded through a procurement office whose director had cycled through 3 different civic positions in 6 years, always just long enough to approve a major funding package before moving laterally into the next role. Clean on paper. Unremarkable individually. But laid side by side with the payment logs, the timing wasn't coincidental. That matters. A private foundation called the Alderton Youth Wellness Initiative appeared in the records 11 times across 3 different transactional layers. It had a functional website, a board of directors, an annual gala with photographs. It had received a commendation from a state senator 18 months ago. It also had a subsidiary company that appeared in the incorporation filings of 2 of the shell entities funding Westfield. Zephyr set that page aside. Then there were the political donors. 3 names. Not low-level. Not peripheral. These were people who had been in rooms with Zephyr before, not in his inner circle, not people he trusted, but people he had stood adjacent to at the kind of events where powerful men signal to each other that they are in the same category. People whose names appeared on building plaques and hospital wings. He sat with those 3 names for a long time. Because embedded in the 43 pages was something else. Something that didn't announce itself. It was a pattern of targeting. The individuals held at Westfield and at the two previous facilities weren't random. They weren't grabbed from the street by chance. There was a selection logic, and once Zephyr identified it, he couldn't unsee it. Each person had a connection to someone in a position of either influence or knowledge. Not always direct. Sometimes second degree, a cousin of a city official, a former associate of a corporate attorney, a person whose disappearance would be noticed in one specific circle but not investigated aggressively because the person who would have pushed hardest for investigation was also the person with the most to lose from what might be uncovered. Caius had been taken because of what Zephyr knew. Not what Caius knew. What Zephyr knew. If Zephyr had continued investigating the Port Territory dispute he'd been working 3 years ago, the one he had quietly stepped back from after Caius disappeared, because the energy required to grieve and rebuild his own internal structure had redirected his attention, he would have found the same financial architecture Marcus found now. He had been steered away from it. Caius had been the steering mechanism. This is important. Pause on that. Someone had looked at Zephyr Cade, assessed what he would chase and what he would abandon, and concluded that making him grieve would make him look inward instead of outward. They had been right. That was the part that sat the heaviest. They had read him correctly. Zephyr turned to the last section of the file. Marcus had included a note at the bottom of page 41, handwritten, which was unusual for Marcus. It said third name on the donor list. Cross-reference with the Cade internal access logs from the fourth quarter, 3 years ago. Zephyr already knew what he would find before he pulled the logs. But he pulled them anyway. Because certainty and confirmation are different things, and he needed confirmation before he moved. The name that appeared in both records was Dorian Ashwell. Not an outsider. Not a peripheral contact. Dorian Ashwell had been inside Zephyr's operational structure for 2 years before Caius disappeared. He had sat in 3 of the same planning meetings where Caius's name had come up, not as a target, not as a liability, but simply as a person Zephyr mentioned. A person Zephyr acknowledged in the small offhand way that meant more than any formal declaration. Dorian Ashwell had been in the room. He had been paying attention. And 6 weeks after the last meeting where Caius's name was spoken, Caius was gone. Zephyr closed the file. The operation was still running. Marcus had confirmed that the Westfield raid had disrupted the network but not dismantled it. 2 other facilities had gone dark immediately after, shuttered within 48 hours of the raid, which meant someone with foreknowledge of the tactical response had issued a warning in time to move assets. Someone inside the response chain. The network had roots in places that didn't expect to be pulled. Zephyr picked up his coffee. It had gone cold. He drank it anyway. And in the quiet of that brownstone at 3 a.m, a decision settled in him that felt less like choice and more like gravity. The clean, inevitable pull of something that was always going to end exactly here. He wasn't going to burn it down. Burning was loud. Burning was visible. Burning gave people time to run and rebuild and reframe themselves as victims of an enemy's aggression. He was going to take it apart. Quietly. From the inside. One connection at a time. Dorian Ashwell's charity auction ran every October at a hotel on the waterfront. This year, 2 weeks after the Westfield raid, the auction's lead corporate sponsor quietly withdrew. No statement. No explanation. Just a phone call to the event's coordinator informing them that the company had decided to redirect its philanthropic focus for the coming fiscal year. That was the first piece. 3 days later, the procurement director who had approved both municipal contracts received a notification from the state comptroller's office that his department had been selected for a routine financial audit. Nothing unusual about the letter. Nothing threatening. Just a standard form with a standard timeline and a list of documents to prepare. The director read it twice. Then he called his attorney. His attorney didn't answer. His attorney was on a call of his own, with a bar association inquiry that had materialized that same morning regarding billing discrepancies on 3 separate client accounts. That was the second piece. Zephyr didn't attend any of these events. He didn't make any of these calls directly. He had spent a week doing something that looked, from the outside, like very little. He had meetings. He reviewed documents. He made a handful of phone calls that were short and unremarkable, and gave nothing away to anyone listening. But the calls went to the right people. And the right people understood, without being told explicitly, that Zephyr Cade was paying attention to something specific, and that being on the wrong side of his attention was a thing you arranged your life to avoid. Marcus handled the financial architecture. He had a gift for finding the precise point in a money structure where one removed connection caused everything downstream to lock up. Not collapse, lock. The difference was important. Collapse was visible. Collapse created news. Lock was quiet. Lock looked, from the outside, like a series of unrelated operational problems. A fund that couldn't clear a transfer. A contractor whose licensing renewal hit an unexpected delay. A board member who received 3 separate requests for financial disclosures from 3 separate entities in the same week and, after consulting with a lawyer who was already managing his own problems, decided that stepping down from the board was the most sensible available option. The Alderton Youth Wellness Initiative's annual gala was postponed. The notice cited scheduling conflicts. Nobody questioned it publicly. Internally, the board was fracturing. 2 members had already submitted resignations. A third had stopped responding to communications entirely. The subsidiary company connecting the foundation to the Westfield funding chain had its operating license flagged by the State Business Registry, a technical issue with the original incorporation filing that had apparently gone unnoticed for 4 years and now required immediate resolution. Real power doesn't prove itself. It reshapes outcomes. Zephyr watched it from a distance and felt none of the satisfaction he expected. Not because it wasn't working. It was working precisely. But satisfaction required a kind of clean resolution that wasn't available here, because dismantling the structure didn't give back what had been taken. It didn't return 3 years. It didn't unteach Cale the habit of silence. It didn't remove the bandaging from Caius's shoulder or put weight back on his frame, or give him back the years he had spent in rooms he hadn't chosen. The machine was being disassembled. But the cost of it had already been paid. By people who didn't owe that debt. Dorian Ashwell was the last piece. Zephyr had saved him deliberately. Not out of sentiment. Not because he wanted to watch him understand what was coming. But because Ashwell was the thread connecting the internal breach to the external network, and Zephyr needed that thread intact long enough to trace everything it touched. On a Tuesday morning, 17 days after the raid, Ashwell arrived at his downtown office to find that his building access card no longer worked. Building security informed him that the company holding his office lease had transferred ownership of the floor overnight, and the new tenant protocols were not yet available. Ashwell stood in the lobby for 6 minutes. Then his phone rang. He looked at the screen. Unknown number. He answered anyway. There was no voice on the other end. Just silence. And then the call disconnected. He understood. That was the point at which Ashwell's personal attorney, whom he managed to reach that afternoon, advised him strongly to consider a voluntary cooperation arrangement with federal investigators. Because the same attorney had received, that morning, a document package containing financial records that he had never seen before and did not want to be holding. The network didn't collapse loudly. It didn't announce itself. It simply became, in the span of 3 weeks, a structure that no longer had the infrastructure to sustain itself. The money stopped moving. The protection stopped holding. The people who had relied on both began making decisions based on self-preservation rather than coordination. And when people start making decisions alone, out of fear, the machine they were part of tells on itself. That was the design. That was always the design. On the 18th day, Marcus put a single document on Zephyr's desk. It was a federal case initiation notice. 3 names listed. Ashwell's was second. Zephyr read it once, set it down, and picked up his jacket. He had somewhere to be. Cale said orange, for the first time on a Thursday. Not to a nurse. Not in response to a question about what color he wanted his cup. He said it to Zephyr, unprompted, while they were sitting on the floor of the therapy room on the 4th floor with a set of colored blocks spread between them. Zephyr looked up from the blue block in his hand. Cale was holding an orange one, studying it with the focused expression he brought to everything. That particular look that meant he was deciding whether something was worth the energy of engaging with fully. He held the block out. Orange, he said again. Like he was testing how it sounded. Like he was deciding if he trusted it. Zephyr took it. Yeah, he said. Orange. Cale considered that for a moment. Then he reached for a red block and held that one out too. They sat like that for 40 minutes. Not talking. Not performing closeness. Just 2 people, one very large, one very small. Building something out of colored pieces on a therapy room floor. Dr. Elkins told Zephyr afterward that Cale had eaten a full breakfast that morning. Both pieces of toast. That was week 2. By week 3, Cale had started following Zephyr to the door at the end of each visit. Not asking him to stay, he hadn't asked for anything directly yet, and Zephyr didn't push that. But he would stand at the door and watch Zephyr walk down the corridor, and he wouldn't go back to the bed until Zephyr turned around at the elevator and looked back. Every time. Without fail. Zephyr started turning around before he reached the elevator. On the 6th floor, things moved differently. Caius's physical recovery was steady, but the rest of it was slower. Some days he talked. Some days he didn't. Some days Zephyr came in and Caius was looking at the window with an expression that made the room feel very large and very empty simultaneously, and Zephyr would sit in the chair beside the bed and not require anything, not conversation, not progress, not acknowledgement, and they would exist in the same space for an hour or 2 without either of them needing it to be more than that. Some days that was enough. Some days it clearly wasn't, for either of them. 3 weeks in, Caius asked, "Is he sleeping through the night?" "Getting there," Zephyr said. "He woke up twice last night. The nurse said he just sat up, looked around, and went back down on his own." Caius nodded slowly. "He used to do that in the facility," he said. "Wake up and check. Make sure I was still there." He said it without looking at Zephyr. Zephyr said nothing. "He waited for you," Caius said, still facing the window. "Even when I told him not to. Not because I thought you wouldn't come." I stopped knowing what to think about that a long time ago. But because I didn't want him spending the energy. A pause. He spent it anyway. The lamp hummed. "He's got your stubbornness," Zephyr said. Caius exhaled, not quite a laugh. Something adjacent to one. Then it went quiet again. But a different kind of quiet than before. Not the heavy silence of 2 people managing pain in the same room. Something that had the faintest amount of air in it. Like a window cracked open just slightly. A week later, Caius turned from the window during one of those long sitting silences and looked at Zephyr directly. "Why didn't you come looking for me?" The question landed clean. No accusation in the delivery. No performance of hurt. Just the question itself, asked plainly, by a person who had been carrying it for a long time and had finally decided the cost of keeping it was higher than the cost of putting it down. Zephyr didn't look away. "I looked for 3 weeks," he said. "My people found nothing. And he stopped. Started again. "I let them tell me what was easier to believe." Caius watched him. "That I left," Zephyr said. A pause. "I knew you better than that," Zephyr continued. "I knew you well enough to know that wasn't who you were. But knowing that meant accepting that something had happened to you. And he stopped again. This time longer. "I chose the version that let me stay functional." "Functional," Caius said. "Yeah. That's a word for it." Zephyr didn't defend it. Because it wasn't defensible. It was just true, the particular ugly truth of a person who had survived everything by converting pain into motion and had applied that same mechanism to the one situation where what was needed wasn't motion at all but presence. Stillness. The willingness to sit inside uncertainty and not look away. He hadn't done that. And 3 years had paid the difference. Caius looked at him for a long moment. "I'm not telling you it's fine," he said finally. "I know. I'm telling you I understand the difference between a choice and a failure." He looked back at the window. "You failed. That's not the same as you choosing this." The room held that. It wasn't forgiveness exactly. It was something more honest than forgiveness. The kind of acknowledgement that doesn't clean the ledger, but opens the door to standing in the same room without the weight crushing both of you equally. Zephyr sat with it. Outside, the city moved. And on the 4th floor, a boy named Cale was eating his second full meal of the day and telling the nurse, in a voice that was getting stronger every morning, that he wanted the orange juice, not the apple. Like he had always known exactly what he wanted. Like he had just been waiting for the right time to say it out loud. 3 days before Caius was cleared for discharge, Cale asked to see him. He didn't ask a nurse. He asked Zephyr. They were in the middle of their afternoon block session, blocks on the floor, the same routine that had become its own language between them, when Cale set down the piece in his hand, looked up, and said with the careful precision of a child who has chosen his words deliberately, "I want to see my dad." Zephyr looked at him. Cale looked back. Waiting. Zephyr stood, held out his hand, and said, "Let's go." They took the elevator to the 6th floor. Cale stood close to Zephyr's leg the whole ride up, not gripping, not hiding, just close, in the way of someone who has learned that proximity is different from dependence, and that choosing to stand near someone you trust is not the same as needing them to hold you up. The door to room 614 was open. Caius was sitting up in bed. He had been cleared to sit upright for the past 4 days, and the color had been coming back to his face slowly, the way light comes back in early morning. Not all at once, but measurably, incrementally, in a direction that moved towards something warmer. He heard them in the hallway before he saw them. The small footsteps gave it away. When Cale came around the doorframe, Caius's face did something that had no clean name. It wasn't just relief. It wasn't just love. It was the specific expression of a person seeing something they had protected through an impossible amount of difficulty arrive on the other side of it intact. Still small, still careful, still carrying the serious eyes, but here. Whole. Cale crossed the room without hesitation. He climbed onto the edge of the bed with the focused efficiency of a child who has decided something and is executing it, and he settled in beside Caius with his back against the pillow and his shoulder pressed into Caius's arm. He didn't say anything. Neither did Caius. Zephyr stood in the doorway. He watched the two of them. The careful man who had survived something enormous, and the small boy who had anchored himself to a name in the dark, and felt the particular weight of a moment that asks nothing of you except to be present inside it. He walked to the chair beside the bed and sat down. The three of them stayed like that for a long time. No performance. No resolution speech. No moment where the difficulty of everything that had happened dissolved cleanly into something easier to hold. Just the room. The lamp. The sound of a monitor that would be disconnected in 3 days. A boy's steady breathing beside the person he had never stopped looking for. After a while, Cale's eyes started going heavy. He fought it the way he fought everything, quietly, with determination, blinking slowly against the weight. But eventually the blinking slowed. Then stopped. His head tipped sideways onto Caius's arm. Asleep. Caius looked down at him. Then up at Zephyr. He waited for you, he said softly. The same words as before. But different now, not weighted with grief this time. Something else in them. Something that had room to breathe. Even when I told him not to spend the energy. I know, Zephyr said. He was right to. Silence. The lamp hummed. Zephyr looked at the small sleeping face. At the hand curled loosely on the blanket. At the shape of a child who had been given one name like a compass and had used it to find his way through the dark to exactly this room. I built something for years, Zephyr said quietly. I thought the point was control. Having enough of it that nothing could touch what mattered. Caius waited. I was wrong about what control was for. He looked at Caius. I'll use it differently now. Caius held his gaze for a moment. Then he looked down at Cale. He's going to want to know everything, he said. When he's older. He's going to ask questions that don't have clean answers. I know. You'll have to stay for those. I know that too. A pause. Outside the window, the city was moving into evening. The light on the walls was going gold and soft. The kind of light that belongs to the part of the day when things slow down long enough for you to feel what you've been carrying. You're the only name he says, Caius said. Quiet. Not sad. Just true. Because you're the only one who stayed this time. Zephyr didn't answer. Because some things don't need an answer. They need a witness. And he was there. He stayed in that chair until the room went dark and the city went quiet and Cale slept on, steady and certain, held between the two people who had built the whole structure of this story without ever meaning to, and who were now, finally, standing inside it together. Not fixed. Not finished. But present. That was the choice. Not revenge. Not power reclaimed. Not a return to what existed before. Just this. A room. A child asleep. Two people deciding, without fanfare, to stop running in opposite directions. The greatest victory isn't reclaiming power. It's reclaiming responsibility. Zephyr looked at his son's face. And for the first time in 3 years, he did not look away. Somewhere in the city, in an office that had already lost its funding and its board and its protection, a piece of paper sat unsigned on a desk. One final node in a network that had believed itself permanent. One remaining thread that hadn't yet been pulled. It would be. Just not tonight. Tonight, something else was more important. If this story moved something in you, if it made you feel seen, or reminded you what it costs to build power while neglecting presence, drop a comment below, and tell us what moment hit hardest. Your words matter here. This channel exists for stories that carry weight, and every comment is proof that they land. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss what comes next. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. Stories like this one are only as powerful as the people willing to pass them forward.